Good morning, everyone. Today, we are going to have a guest lecture session with our guest lecturer, Ibu Diah Citra Prastuti. Ibu Citra Diah Prastuti ya, atau Ibu Citra, Mbak Citra. So, we are going to discuss about podcast. Ibu Citra, she is in the field, in the radio field for almost 15 years, I think more than 15 years, yeah. She has been in KBR, Kantor Berita Radio, previously known as 68H, ya, because it's addressed in Utan Kayu nomor 68H, ya, kalau tidak salah, ya. She has been in KBR for more than 15 years, and now she is the editor-in-chief or pemimpin redaksi kbr.id. KBR is Indonesia's first independent and largest radio network that encompass 500 radio stations across Indonesia in 34 provinces. And then it already launched its podcast, KBR Prime, Instagram account, website, and lots of channel for broadcasting their content. The reason why we have Ibu Citra and KBR for our class today, because we are discussing about new media, right? In Binus, we have 3 streaming in communication, journalism, public relation, and entertainment communication, right? In all of those streaming, we talk a lot about new media. Later, Ibu Citra will discuss whether podcast it's like a new media or actually it's an old one, but now it become new. Everybody during the pandemic creating podcasts, yeah. In a way, it looks like quite simple in a way, ya. I mean, kalau dilihat gitu ya. But actually there are lots of trick and tips. There are also, it should be created properly when you decide what to share on podcast, and then what are differences between podcast and radio, or maybe compared to Instagram Live, yeah, or IGTV or YouTube. What are the differences? And what we can do in our different field to also create impactful content, yeah, based on our today's topic, creating impactful content on podcast. Okay, so without further ado, please Ibu Citra, Mbak Citra, yeah, you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Let me share my screen in a moment. Okay, I hope you can see my screen now. Okay, so the title of this guest lecture session is Creating Impactful Content in Podcast. Thank you for the introduction. And of course, nowadays, young people like you guys are all familiar with podcasts because most of you probably have Spotify on your smartphone. And you probably have a list of podcasts that you like and you listen to every day. So why do people turn to podcasts? Mbak Karin mentioned earlier that it's pandemic time. Everyone stays at home and they don't have anything else to do and then start creating podcasts. And that's also true. And but the basic outline of why do people turn to podcasts is because we're going fully digital and we're attached to our smartphones. So we're very drawn to that. We want everything that we consume follow our path, follow our activity, follow our schedule, not the other way around, because we want everything on demand and on the move. And also with podcasts, it offers intimate interaction. Unlike YouTube, where the host always say, "Hi guys," which means mass audience, in podcast, you feel that the host is talking to you and only you. And there's also a sense of voyeurism in listening to podcasts because you want to eardrop to what other people are talking about. We want to keep up with your idols, what they're talking about. You want to be in the loop of everything. So it's a part of why we are drawn to podcasts nowadays. Previously, in the analog world, we know about radio. Radio and podcast is mainly an audio content, but radios has certain aspects that are different with podcasts. With radio, you have to be on schedule. If you miss the schedule, then you miss the whole show. And when you miss the show, then it means that you don't always start from the beginning. While with podcasts, you should start from the beginning. People cannot just jump to minute 15 or something. And then with podcasts, it serves niche audience, like a small dedicated one, while radio serves like mass audience. And then with podcasts, it's always pre-recorded, while radio is live show. And this brings another aspects for podcasts. It has long time shelf, and on the radio, it's very short. And with radio, they have certain formats. For example, in radio, you have what we call block segments, while with podcasts, you can just go on for an hour without any breaks. This is the timeline of podcasts that we're currently seeing. I'm combining the timeline of podcasts in the global world, in the US, but in particular, and also in Indonesia, and how it impacts in Indonesia. In the year 2000, it's not easy to find podcasts unless you have iPhone with iTunes. Then you can easily listen to podcasts. And you can also look for it on SoundCloud. But other than that, it's quite not easy to find. In 2015, the serial podcast is a big hit, but it's a very slow take in Indonesia. In Indonesia, we have the first mover of podcasts. It's Podcast Subjektif and also Podcast Awal Minggu. Both of them are often called as the father of Indonesian podcast scene. So in 2018, we finally have our first survey on podcast by Daily Social. And we learn a little bit about what people know about podcasts, how do people consume podcasts. And then at the same time, Spotify is open for podcasts. Usually at the first time, Spotify is only for listening to songs, but and then they have this audiobook, but not podcast. So in 2018, they're open for podcasts, and its podcast listening grows 175%. So it's the trend is growing, and at the same time, KBR launches KBR Prime. So we want to tap in the global trend as well. In 2019, Spotify chart is still dominated by US podcasts, with a growing number of local podcasts. If you see the chart back in 2019, you can still see lots of US podcasts there, but now compared to now in 2020, all the chart is dominated. The chart is dominated by local podcasts. So it's growing very significantly in Indonesia. Indonesia has the biggest podcast listener on Spotify in Southeast Asia. So it's a big market for Spotify, and also for people to start working on podcasts. Spotify in 2020 turns a number of popular podcasts as exclusive, and now they even have this certain album in Spotify. If you look at the Spotify, they have this certain called exclusives and originals, because they are going to grow this exclusives and originals on Spotify. Sorry. Okay. So I mentioned about the survey. So I put here a comparison of survey between what Daily Social did in 2018 and Suarane did in 2019. So we can see the growth, the trends, the differences between these surveys. Suarane is a podcast by Rane Hafid, is a senior journalist, also a senior podcaster. He did this survey back in December 2019, so it's quite current, and we want to see the comparison between the Daily Social. If you see on the left side, on Daily Social, only like 80% listens in the past 6 months, but Then in the recent survey, it's 80% listen to podcasts in the past 1 week. So it's growing very significantly. And also another interesting thing is on daily social survey, they are still comparing between podcast and radio, while on the recent survey, they're more focusing on the listenership habit of podcasts and also how what do people like and how do people find out about podcasts. But one thing stays the same: people likes the entertainment content and also the chit chat formats of the podcast. And on the popular platform, we see that Spotify is still there as the main source of podcasts for Indonesian listeners. And also we see now Inspigo. Inspigo is an app, podcast app, motivational, self-help kind of podcast they do there. So I want to reflect this global trend and also the survey to what we did as a media in KBR. Probably most of you don't know KBR yet because we are most well known in the regional parts, because in Jakarta people are bombarded with information. It's different with people in the regions because they have limited access of information, and radio is one of the most reliable access to information. That's why we're focusing more on the provinces instead of on in Jakarta. And if you're in your car, for example, you want to tune into KBR, you can't, because we are not FM station, we are radio news agency. We started as one radio news agency in 1991 with 7 radio partners. Now we have 500 radio partners in 34 provinces. And then we tap into the digital transformation by having our own news website. Who doesn't? And then, but we feel like we're lacking the audio identity on the news website. We want to find something that showcase our love of audio and also our strength in journalism. And that's why in 2018, we started to focus on podcast business to showcase both of our strengths to our audience with a new format. And fortunately, the trend is going that direction, so we want to ride the wave as well. So what makes podcasts from KBR Prime different from other producers? Because it's journalism based, we want to celebrate new ideas, and also we want to push for the betterment of society. That's why the tagline of our podcast is called Podcast for Curious Mind, because that's what we want to celebrate in podcasts, talking about new ideas, not just chit chat, rambled ideas, and etc. This is the library so far that we have. We have 30 plus podcasts. Some are season based, some are daily based, some are weekly basis. So each and every podcast is different. They have their own different formats. Some are news updates. We have bulletins. We also have Q&A. We have storytelling. So we have various formats and topics that we cater. One of the most recent ones that we launched is Climate Tales, the one below. It's a storytelling on climate change. So it's a delicate issue. So we want to bring it closer to the people by doing it as a story. And then the mantra that we have in KBR Prime in doing our podcast is create, collaborate, and cross-platform. We create our own podcast. We also collaborate with other third party to produce the podcast, and we put it as a cross-platform content because we also have the radio network and also the podcast platform. We also distribute to Spotify, Google Podcasts, and etc. So we want to combine all the platforms all together, trying to reach out new audience. This is our journey so far with the podcast. Podcast development and growth in Indonesia. We produced this Hidup Usai Teror. It's a series of podcasts, investigative one. It's a tremendous hard work for a small newsroom like us. but it was rewarded with Best Reporting on Children from AJ Indonesia and UNICEF. So it's very good. The Hidup Usai Teror tells stories in 8 episodes about children who are impacted with whose parents are suicide bombers. So we follow the lives of the children, and then we tell the story through their eyes. And then in 2020, we also launched Dear Dearest. It's a Spotify original. We are also the part of the first batch of Spotify original podcasts. We're turning love letters into podcasts. So it's an ongoing one. Yesterday was our new current episode with letters from Jenny Yusuf. Sorry, today is what day is it today? It's just last week we launched the latest episode. The letter is written by Jenny Yusuf and read by Ardhito Pramono. And also we have this podcast competition. We targeted to university students, and then this is our second podcast competition this year, and we have lots of submission. That's very surprising. We are very happy that many students are joining this competition. And then we recently have this online party event. It's called KBR Prime Podcast Party. We talk about the development, the growth, the enthusiasm that people have with podcasts. So after talking about the podcast in general, the situation, how it shapes KBR's business as well, this is the current situation. Spotify chart is dominated with local contents. You can always see the top podcasts on Spotify. Based on this chart, you can see that most popular topics are entertainment, horror, comedy, and then contemplative one. Like Rintik Seduh Podcast Mas is like just exchanging rank every now and then. And the most popular format is one is monologue like Rintik Seduh, and the other one is the kind of obrolan tongkrongan like the one that Podcast Mas has. In April 2020, Spotify recorded 1 million podcasts on Spotify. And according to Spotify, the first quarter in 2020 is the biggest ever for organic podcast creation on Spotify. So it's big, and Indonesia is the biggest market in Southeast Asia. So it matters a lot, Indonesian market and Indonesian podcaster for Spotify. With that comes the problem. One is the discoverability. With 1 million podcasts on Spotify, you have to really stand out for people to find your podcast. Otherwise, people don't even know that you have a podcast. And then people usually come to podcasts for entertainment, for listening to songs at first. So people tend to look for entertaining contents instead of news contents, because on the other case, on Apple Podcast case, 23% people come for news on Apple Podcasts. So it's quite different. So we come to the question of the day, because we want to create a impactful content. Is there any room for non-horror or non-comedy podcasts? The answer is always yes. We have Dear Dearest. This is our take on turning love story into podcast. It's now on 45 place on top podcast. We have 50,000 plus streams and also 5,000 followers. This is the biggest number of our all KBR podcasts, because the recipe here is we have 2 celebrities in each episode. Like I mentioned, we have Jenny Yusuf and also Ardhito Pramono in one episode. So we are trying to reach out to Jenny Yusuf fan base and also Ardhito Pramono's fan base. Love Buzz is a Q&A. It's on LGBTQIQ, human relationship, minority groups, human rights, but we don't use those words as the title of the podcast. Instead, we use the universal language of love. It's a very sensitive and delicate issue. That's why we want to create this podcast as a safe space as well, both for the listeners and also for the speakers. Diskusi Psikologi is a our top podcast as well. It's in collaboration with Into the Light, a community on suicide prevention thing. And this has a very unique approach because we have this storyteller or penutur kisah, and then responded by psychologists. So it's a full episode in each one. We have the quote unquote problem and then the solution. And this is produced with care as well because it's a very sensitive issue. Climate Tales, that as I mentioned before, we want to make climate change issues closer to our daily life situation because people are not aware that what they do every day also impacted the earth. We shape it as a story so that we don't sound like preaching to the audience. And this is the first podcast on climate crisis in Indonesia. And for example, the latest episode was on slow fashion because we buy clothes all the time without knowing how it was made, how many gallons of water does it take to create one piece of t-shirt, something like that. Those podcasts are from the KBR universe, and this one from other producer, Magdalene's Mind, is produced by Magdalene. It's a web magazine on feminism issues. So they're using feminism as a lens in seeing and understanding things. It's not on feminism per se, but also how they look at things. Hamburger is a podcast by Human Rights Watch Group. Conversational, it's fun, it's light, but they talk about human rights issues because they want young people to learn and be educated about human rights as well. And this is podcast Limas Kawan. This is something that I recently found out. It's a conversational produced by 5 friends in Padang. They talk about what matters to young people in Padanese language. So it's nice. I wouldn't be able to understand that, but it's a good approach to reach out to local audience. In short, there's always room for new ideas and approaches. So it's your turn. Podcast is a platform. We have to fill that with your ideas. We find the uniqueness, subject, tone, blah, blah, blah. You don't always have to be number one to be successful. You can push your ideas towards to the universe, and that's also one big step. Treat your products with respect. We follow ethics. We beware of the do's and don'ts. In KBR, we always apply the journalism ethics because we're based as journalists. But with your podcast, it's important also to treat them as certain products. It's like a journalism products because then you would treat them with care. Okay, so what do we need to create our own podcast? First thing first, of course, idea. And then we have to find a team. It can be a one-person show, but it's good to have friends to discuss with. The tools don't have to be too fancy. Formats and outreach. I just want to go through this quickly. The tools, it's microphone, smartphone, headphone, audio editing software. There are plenty of choices, free softwares outside, so you can just pick one that you like the most. You have to learn how to use the tools. The tools is there. You have your budget. You can adjust that with your budget, but then you have to learn how to use these tools. For example, with the microphone, you have to be aware when you're recording for a podcast because people listen to podcasts through earphones, and it means audio only. If your audio is not good, then so bye-bye. So you have to be aware of, like, for example, you're recording in a room with air conditioning. The machine will start sounds, so it doesn't good, and it will go through the mic. With glass walls, it will reflect your sound. So you can learn those things available on YouTube, everything. So you just need to look further. The simple way to produce a podcast, if you don't want to be bothered with all this equipment, you can use anchor.fm or talk to a friend through Zoom meeting like this and then record that. That's also a way. Just be aware of the internet connection. This is the formats I will go through quickly because I will send these materials over to Makarin as well. The interview, the Q&A, we have several podcasts available with this format. And this is also the most overused format of podcasts. It makes you struggle to stand out. The monologue is like the rintik sendu part. You have to be very strong in delivering your story, otherwise people won't stay. Conversational is what we see on Podcast Mas, on Rapot, chatty, lively, blah, blah, blah. And then the non-fictional storytelling is not very common in Indonesia. We have KBR produces daily non-fictional storytelling in a podcast called Saga. The most popular one is of course Serial, produced by, and also this American Life. This is a very good approach that very challenging to try. It's fictional storytelling. It needs to have a very strong story structure, a very strong audio production, etc. So this is very complicated one. Maybe that's why not many people are doing this kind of format, because it's time consuming. This is the repurposed content. So what we do also in KBR, we turn our radio stuff into podcast to make it stay longer on the circulation. So this is what we do. NPR also do that with their radio programs. So an outreach, because as we see in our daily lives how we are so attached to social media, and the recent survey also say that people know about new podcasts through social media. It's important to be out there on social media and shout out. One of the ways to promote podcast audio content on social media is through what we call with audiogram. So this is the left one is the audiogram that we produce for one of the episodes for Dear Dearest. I want to play this. Hope you can listen to that. Okay, so that's nggak bisa ya kedengeran. Okay, so this is the second example of audiogram. You have different formats and it's quite easy to produce as well. Okay, so this is our way to share snippets of the podcast and then drive them to listen to the whole podcast on the platform. Sorry. Okay, so let's not go to the assignment first. Let's go to Mbak Karin for further discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chitra. Yeah. You know what? Even though I know I heard podcast a lot, especially during not only during the pandemic. I mean, in Jakarta, I think is one of the reason why I hear a lot of podcasts. Yeah? But now, listening to your presentation, it's like open my eyes that actually there are lots of things that we can do on podcasts that are unique and maybe cannot be done in other format. Yeah, I am interested in one point when you say that it is on demand compared to on schedule if it is radio or other format. And then I also see in your presentation that we have to build audio identity, so it will be noticeable to your audience. Yeah, Actually, it is like similar to other media. You have to stand out to make it special, and everybody will listen to your podcast. But I think there are specific approach, yeah, for podcasts. I see there non-news content like horror, self-help, religion. Yeah, I think there are lots of kajian Islam and other religious content on a podcast. And later it expand to some or more news-based content. Yeah, I am also interested when you say that you also produce the investigative content. Yeah, the kids of suicide bomber, and then you created like an investigative story. I mean, previously I don't know that those kind of things are deliverable through podcast as well, and it's actually different way that you can listen to this kind of investigative, which is good. Yeah. Okay, so I have some question, but I think I will ask the audience, the participants, yeah, students or lecturers, if you have a question before we continue with the discussion, please. My newsroom and new media classroom, yeah, we have newsroom class in here, Bu Chitra, yeah, so they also learn about new media. I think there are things that we can ask Bu Chitra about new media, maybe the newsroom. You mentioned about the small newsroom you have, yeah, compared to maybe TV or even radio or print, yeah, how you manage the small newsroom, for example, yeah. Okay, so I give the opportunity for students to ask, or lecturers, yeah, you can also ask. Please use this opportunity to ask.
Another opportunity is also for lecturers to use podcast
Yeah.
as learning and teaching tools.
Okay, okay, we have Aura. Yes, please, Aura, just turn on your microphone, and then you can ask your question.
Okay. Hello, Bu Chitra. My name is from Journalism Streaming. I want to ask, since the trend of podcast is still relatively new here in Indonesia, how do we measure the success of a podcast? Is it through deals, perhaps, or engagement, or is there any other factor to measure it? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Aura. Maybe we have 2 more questions, yeah, so you can answer them at once, yeah. Okay, thank you, Aura. Any other question? Aura asked about the measurement, yeah, how to measure the successful of your podcast. Other question? Pak Irmawan, maybe the lecturer from PR Publication, you want to ask question?
Okay. Hello, Bu Chitra.
Hello.
So my question is actually, I mean, we know that the top 10 or the top 2 probably is entertainment and celebrities who deliver the podcast. So what are your thoughts on a collaboration between an amateur podcaster with someone who already have an audience in the podcast scene? Thank you, Bu Chitra.
Okay, thank you, Mas Irmawan. One more question. Maybe public relation students, you want to ask question, because this is actually not only for journalism-based content, it can also be from other content. Okay, Arya, we have Arya. Okay, Arya, please, you can unmute your microphone. Yeah. Arya asked question in chat, yeah. Arya, can you, yeah. Oh, my mic is broken. Okay, I just read Arya's question, yeah. I'm new to the podcast trend. I'd like to know about the profile of people who are listening to podcasts. Do they usually play them while in commute, while studying, or something else differently? Okay, Okay, so you got the 3 questions, Ms. Chitra, yeah? Okay, so we answer the 3 questions first before we move on to next question. Silakan.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. They are very great questions. Aurelia, how do we measure success? That's always tricky. With digital, the numbers are easy to be found because when you upload your content on Anchor.fm, for example, you can get the statistic very easily. How many people listen to your podcast? How many people stays until what minutes? They can also provide you that with that kind of statistics. How many male, female, and not saying gender listen to your podcast, and also where they come from. There's also the statistics that are provided by Spotify, which can let you know which song that your podcast listener are listening to. So it's kind of like a good reality check whether your podcast is reaching out to your targeted audience or not. But number is not the only one, because as in related with Pak Irmawan question, it's very hard to compete with podcasts produced by celebrities with entertainment, strong entertainment aspects. For example, we want to do podcast on, let's say, fact checking or data journalism. That's something that you're passionate about. Then it's hard to compare it. It's not apple to apple with Podcast Mas or even to Rintik Sendu. So you just need to find your market, your target audience, and grow your niche and loyal market. That's what makes it different with podcasts. It's good to know the numbers, but don't let it make you sad because when you produce something and the number is not growing. Because what matters the most is how you push your ideas across, how you articulate your ideas, and how you give your perspective in certain contents. For example, we did this podcast competition just recently. The topic is surviving Corona ala gue. We're aiming to students, university students, and we have quite a lot of different perspectives talking about staying at home, learning from distance from university students. Some are very quite harsh in criticizing their lecturers, for example, for not being ready and not adaptive with the situation, blah, blah, blah. So it's nice to see a different perspective in one particular subject. And this is the kind that you can push around. What makes you different? Why should I listen to you? This is the question that you have to answer first. And then you can start moving on. How do you measure your success? Because the measurement of success is different for every podcast. And Pak Irmawan, the top 10 is entertainment. What are your thoughts about collaboration between amateur and celebrities? If we look closely, the number 2 now is Rintik Sedu. Rintik Sedu is not celebrity. She is like she's like any one of us here, and then she started to wrote that and publish that and podcast, and apparently people like that kind of format. So it's we also see a number of non-professional, non-celebrity people doing podcasts and creating success there. It's a good thing to collab with entertainers or celebrities, but we have to go back to ourselves. What do we sell to them? Why do they would want to be with us and producing the podcast? Because they, as celebrities, they have the tools, they have the team and everything to start their own podcast. For example, this is what the podcast Raditya Dika, one of the first episodes, he invited Adriano Colby. Adriano Colby was known as the father of Indonesian podcast in Indonesia. And one of the first question that Raditya Dika asked to Adriano is, can you make money with podcasts? So this is the kind of approach that celebrities have in mind when producing podcasts. They want to make this as another new revenue stream. so it may be quite a different take from what the vision that we have by producing podcasts, like delivering our ideas, blah blah blah. So it's not solely on creating revenue streams, although it's also good to have a new money coming from podcasts. But yeah, we all have our different reasons. And when it comes to collaborating, I think it's best to find a partner who shares the same vision with you. For example, that's also what we do in KBR in producing diskusi psikologi. We share the same vision and mission with the community into the light, and then we produce that together because we think that mental health issue is an important issue, but people don't want to talk about openly, and probably only talk about mental health issue when we see a suicide case on media, and then we start talking about the importance of mental health issue, blah blah blah. But we don't just discuss it openly and on daily basis. This is what we want to twist with Diskusi Psikologi podcast. Arya on the chat box, let me check again.
Where do people usually hear?
Yeah, the profile is young people. 18 to 24 is the biggest number for most of the podcasts. So young people are turning to podcasts, maybe because it's just easy. It doesn't take too much internet quota as compared to YouTube, for example, and you can do it while doing others. Do they usually play them while in commute or while studying? So at first, we kind of think that people listen to podcasts while doing things because that's what in the US, that's what people in the US, how do people in US consume podcasts? While jogging, while cooking, while doing household chores and everything. But in Indonesia, according to the recent survey in 2019, apparently people listen to podcasts more in the evening after all the hassle ends, and then they want to rest, and then they start listening to podcasts. So it's not during the commute, but in the evening before bedtime. So it's a different kind of consumption habit between the US and Indonesia, and we have to learn more about the Indonesian podcast listeners to be able to create a podcast that is suitable for them. For example, in the US, because people use podcasts mostly during commuting, they shape the duration of the podcast according to the time used for commuting. So there's a survey that the commuting time is approximately 20 minutes. That's why there's like the recent survey in the US shows that most of the podcasts are now reshaping to 20 minutes because it's the same time as commuting time. So it's a different thing with Indonesia. So we have to learn more about Indonesian podcast listener habit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Aura, Arya, and Pak Irmawan, and also Chitra, for the answer. Any other question? Yeah, while waiting for other question, I have one thing, Ms. Chitra. In the examples that you just show us, there are different format of podcasts. Starting from monologue, Q&A, even Q&A. There are different types of Q&A. Conversational, kayak orang ngobrol. And then two hosts, and then like a chit-chat things, and then more than two hosts, in one podcast. So let's say we or students, we start to create our own podcast, Which format do you think the most doable, or which one is the most, I'm not saying the easiest, maybe easy or not, depends on the purpose and the person, but based on your experience and your observation through different podcast channel, what do you think the most doable format for podcast? Thank you.
Okay, the most doable format, I think, is the Q&A. You can just grab a friend and grab a mic and then do the conversation. But before doing that, it's very important to prepare like a question list, because otherwise you would definitely start your podcast with, okay, hi, blah, blah, how are you, blah, blah, what do you want to talk about? And it's very common if we listen to podcasts like 2 years ago, but with the current situation where people are creating more and more professional look for the podcast, you need to sell something good from the very beginning. So especially because, for example, you're not famous, so you have to drag people's attention from the very beginning with what you have to say, with what you want to discuss about, and give the audience a reason to listen to you. So the doable format is Q&A, but you have to prepare that first. Like, preparation is halfway to success. So it's good to have your question list ready, to also create a structure for your podcast, so you don't like go here and there and then wonder about, and then you got clueless and then with the conversation, so it's not good. And have a good audience in mind. What I'm saying is, you have to imagine who you're talking to while doing this podcast. Are you talking to 30-something people? Are you talking to 20-something people? What kind of life do you imagine they would have? Are you sharing the same life experience that your audience have? It's also something important in shaping your podcast.
Okay, so we can learn, or we can start to create the interview, the Q&A format, yeah, at least for practicing. Maybe later when we are able to have longer content, we can do monologue about a topic, yeah. But monologue can also be done by like regular random people, not necessarily for the monologue format. Does it have to be from public figure or someone with specific expertise, or what?
Rintik Seduh is just a girl talking about her life in random occasions, but it draws a lot of attention because she speaks with the language. She speaks about the topics that matter to people at their age. So it's like talking to a friend, and that's what she also mentioned in the podcast. I'm a friend who listens. That's why people are drawn to that line, and then it makes Rintik Seduh mostly on #1 chart on Spotify. So it doesn't.
Okay,
but yes, you have to have something interesting. Otherwise, people just won't listen to you. Discoverability is a key problem in Spotify, because I think it's just like in YouTube. People can just become a vlogger anytime with any topic, but then do people find
to maintain,
you? Yeah, and then it takes consistency to produce one. I mean, like, okay, let's say you have a certain topic, you produce 2 to 5 episodes, and then you don't have so many people coming, and then you start thinking to stop doing podcasts. So it takes consistency and energy to create new episodes. It also takes time as well.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Chitra. Okay, we open the second round for the question.
Hi.
Okay, from public relation class.
I have a question.
Please, Budian.
Hi.
Yes, Ms. Dian.
Ibu Chitra. Thank you, Ms. Karian. Ibu Chitra, do you know who are the biggest audience of podcasts in Indonesia? And then I personally actually mostly listen to podcasts because of storytelling, because it's kind of remind me of my teenage years where radio drama is actually a hit. Yeah. And then I know that storytelling in podcasts in the US, it's very big, but do you think the trend is also going to happen in Indonesia? Thank you.
Okay, what podcast do you listen to, Budian?
Currently, I'm listening to Sleep With Me. It's just rambling story to help you go to sleep. It's not like I need that, but I just like the stories because it's simple, and then it's easy listening while you prepare to go to sleep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Budian. We have three students in the chat. Erlangga Bayu, okay, please unmute your microphone.
Hello, Bu Citra. I want to ask you, me as a public relations student, does podcast could help our brand to grow? Do you think by creating a podcast? Because I rarely see a brand creating their own podcast or even companies.
Okay, thank you, Bayu. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, later Miss Citra can answer. We have Zahra. Please unmute your microphone, Zahra.
Hi, Bitra. I want to ask a question about podcast on YouTube, like what Deddy Corbuzier does. I mean, how can you differentiate podcast and YouTube and talk show? Because I think podcast on YouTube, it's similar with talk show, and I don't really understand the difference between it. And sometimes celebrities do podcasts on YouTube by just inviting people to talk together, and they call it podcast without even uploading an specific audio content on Spotify or any audio platform. They just upload it on YouTube, and people are focusing on the visual rather than the audio and the conversation itself. What are your thoughts about it?
Okay. Thank you, Zahra. That's also a good question. Yeah, Bu Citra will answer later. Last one, we also have Pandu. Pandu, please unmute your microphone.
Okay, yes. My question is, for a first-time person in creating a podcast, as you mentioned before, it's better to differentiate yourself. So I was asking, for the for the topic of creating, the topic on what the podcast would be, is it better to follow the trends, like what podcasts are popular, or is it, as mentioned a couple times before, to try to differentiate yourself with other podcasts? If so, what's like the expectation of the person when they start after their first podcast? That's my question.
Sorry, can you
thank you.
clarify the last question, Pandu? What do you mean by expectation, blah, blah, blah?
Like what's the how I suggest, like, should so excuse me for a moment, like, should the person should they be like happy depending on the successfulness of their podcast the first time they starting podcast, how should they improve on the next one, something like that?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pandu. Okay, so we have 4 questions from Ibu Dian, Bayu, Zahra, and Pandu. 4 questions, please, Ms. Citra.
Okay, there are very interesting and strong questions. I really like having these questions because it also challenges the way I see podcasts in my daily activities. So for Budian, the biggest audience is, like I mentioned before, is 18 to 24. Some podcasts are for 30 to 40, but I think the seeing from a different podcast that we created, the biggest chunk is 18 to 24. So it's your students' age, your these people on this Zoom age. So it's interesting to see the growth of the audience on this particular age. And the storytelling, yes, I agree with you that in the US, the storytelling format grows very rapidly, while in Indonesia, not really. because it takes more skills, audio skills and storytelling skills to do that. For example, in the radio time, it's easier to do a morning show with a chit chat compared to a radio drama, because it takes a lot to create a radio drama, time consuming and everything. So can we see the storytelling trend going to happen in Indonesia? Probably, but not in a short time, I think. But we need also to educate the listeners as well that there are other formats available. I think because the podcast scene in Indonesia is very, very young, we have to educate one another. The podcaster needs to educate the listeners about the variety of topics, a variety of formats, and also from a business side, because we are media and we are doing this with clients as well, we have to educate the clients the importance of doing podcasts and why it's important to, following the question from Erlangga as a PR student, to help brand communicate their values and mission and vision to the audience with the podcast. So I would go straight directly to the second question. Can podcasts help brand to grow? Yes, definitely. It's not common in Indonesia, but it started to show here and there. Unilever, PCA also have their own podcast, and also we have this. We invited them as a speaker in our podcast party. It's called e-podcaster. So it's a podcast on financial, saham and everything. So it's education. They don't do hard sell, of course, on podcasts, but they educate people on the topic, on how to start your own financial journey, blah, blah, blah. And so it's an evergreen topic. People would always want to learn about how to use your money wisely. So it's a good way to approach your audience. In the US, we see various formats of that brands are using in communicating their values. For example, it's GE, I forgot the name of the podcast. General Electrics are doing this podcast with fictional story, created with journalism aspects. And then the story is on innovation, and the innovation used in the story is based on the products of General Electric. So it's a way to communicate what you have in store to your audience, while at the same time educate your listeners about the product itself, very subtle, in a very subtle approach. So, and McDonald's also have this podcast called Great Sauce or Great Recipe, I forget the name. This is how they communicate the value of the company, because that's what make a company strong and big, the value, the mission that they share to the public, and that's what they want to communicate to the audience. So yes, definitely podcast can help brand to grow, but it's not with a strong, hard selling approach. Zahra, interesting question. Podcast on YouTube. I recently did a session with, I think it's with Lembaga Pers Dr. Sutomo, and we have a similar question like this one. The question was from a journalist from the ITV. So she's a TV journalist, and she is asking the question of how can we produce a good video podcast for TV program? So it's a very complicated question. So what are you trying to produce? Is it a podcast, is it a video podcast, or TV program? So the question shows that we are living in a borderless platform. You can, without probably don't have the real understanding of what podcast is. Podcast is audio content, but then in Indonesia, people are very visual. So that's, I think that also explains why celebrities are doing both, sometimes video and audio podcasts. Like Deddy Corbusier do both, Raditya Dika also do both. And one of the things that I think why they do both, because they can monetize the content on YouTube, because it's not available now on Spotify. With YouTube, you can just put there, and when you have a certain amount of audience, the money just gets in. But with Spotify, it's not happening right now. So you have to find your clients, blah blah blah, and put it on as ad libs on your podcast, etc. So it's not the automatic system is not there yet on Spotify, but I believe they will do that soon, seeing the growth of Indonesian podcast listeners. And that's also exactly, I did a comparison I'm listening to an episode on Raditya Dika on Spotify, and then also watch it on YouTube. They both are very similar to one another. On Spotify, you don't listen to any ads. But on YouTube, I think for that 1 hour episode, they have like 5 ads. So in a way, they create one content, put it on 2 different platforms, and make money in one of the platforms. So it's a business approach for them as well. So how do you differentiate between podcast and YouTube and talk show? Just remember that podcast, YouTube is a platform where you can deliver your content. Talk show or storytelling is the format how you deliver your content. So it's a mix between where you put it and how you put it. And you can always do both, like audio and video podcasting, but there are certain topics that probably best being done in audio only. For example, with Love Buzz. Love Buzz is a podcast on LGBTQIQ, minority groups, and also human rights. The podcast itself creates a safe space for the speakers to speak out. One of the speakers that we have on the podcast is someone who haven't even come out to the parents. And then he decided to share his very personal story to the podcast, to Love Buzz. I cannot imagine that being done in a video set where you can see the face. We probably cannot persuade this person to be a speaker to share this story, because while otherwise on audio people feel more comfortable because they cannot see you. That's also one thing. So the last question is from Pandu. For the first time podcaster, what topic do we do? Do we follow the trends or following differentiate yourself? This is also a discussion, the topic that we discussed during the podcast party. We invite podcast Malam Kliwon. It's one of on the top 10 on the Spotify chart. It's also one of the many horror podcasts in Indonesia. That's also one of the first questions that we ask. You know that horror is abundant with many podcasters. Why do you decide to still do that? So one thing is they believe that they have a different approach in doing the horror story because they're combining with comedy. So they want to bring the kind of 80s vibe with horror and comedy. And then they realize deeply that they are entering a red market, red ocean and blue ocean. This is something that marketing people know by heart. Whether you go to the red ocean or the blue ocean is a very, it's your own decision based on data and everything. You can just go decide where to go, but you have to be aware of the competition, of the unique selling point that you have. You can follow the trends. For example, you can create your own podcast talk, something like that, with chit chat, very lively, very entertaining, blah, blah, blah. But how do you differentiate you and Reza Chandika in Rapot or the people in Podcast? So you have to sell your personality. That's how they do that, right? They're selling their personality, their liveliness, their jokes and everything, inside jokes as well, to communicate with the audience. So so it's your decision to follow the trends or not. In KBR, we do both. At one point, we follow the trend as in the news trend, what people talk about on social media, on news, blah, blah, blah. But we also push our ideas. For example, the Climate Tales or the Gambut Pakisah. Gambut Pakisah is a podcast on gambut. Like, what do you know about gambut other than when we have this karhutla news item on newspaper, on TV? Other than the kebakaran hutan dan lahan, we don't know anything about gambut because we live so far away from Kalimantan, from Sumatra. We don't even feel the haze coming out from the karhutla. So this is something that we want to push new ideas, to celebrate the new idea, that celebrate new knowledge and everything with the podcast. Expectation of the podcast, what to expect and how to improve, because it's on digital platform, the statistic is there. You can learn by learning at your statistic. For example, on Spotify, you have this start and stream. The start thing is when you click play, but don't stay until 60 seconds. The stream is for those who stay all the way until the end. So you have to learn about the numbers and how you react upon that. For example, with the virus, each week we thoroughly learning something new about the podcast. We learn as we put more on social media, engage with the fan base of the celebrities. We have more plays, but we are still learning also on the podcast listeners on what makes them stay and what makes them leave. It's with the digital, we have the numbers, but you don't have the summary. It's not being fed to you what to do next. No, you have to learn it by yourself. It's a big trial and error for everyone in the digital world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, yeah, Bu Citra. I think most of the questions are that, and we can learn further from your answer as well. Yeah. Okay, we open the next session. Before we have next question, I have one question from me, Bu Citra. Yeah. You talked earlier about our audience in Indonesia is more on a visual audience. Yeah, they like YouTube or streaming more compared to listening to audio only. But in the examples of podcast channel in Indonesia, which is growing also, how you are as people who play in the podcast industry or in the podcast field, educate audience, educate the public to also know that this is a new and not entirely new actually, but this is like the alternatives of listening or consuming news or content. Yeah, I think that's for me. While I'm collecting some other question, please, Bu Citra.
Okay, so Indonesia is very visual, and yes, I believe we have to educate each stakeholders on the use of podcasts. For example, we approach to brand, to companies, and then educate them that that podcast is a current trend, and you can make use of podcasts as well to communicate to your brand image to the public. And that's always important for brand to be able to be perceived positively in the audience. So there's always the tendency of the public to know more about the company that they like. For example, we have this like small UMKM thing that draws very big attention from its followers because they communicate what their ideas, their thoughts, and everything. That's what's missing probably from big brands, big companies, because they don't go reach out to the people so much. So it's one thing to educate them about the tool, how they can benefit from the tool. And for example, we also reach out to CSO, to NGOs to start using podcasts as their campaign tools because it's easy to do. It will be there forever, and then they can, because some of the campaigning materials are like over and over again, being used over and over. So why not doing that as podcasts? Because it can be distributed very easily on WhatsApp group and everything. It doesn't take as much internet quota compared to YouTube. So it's a good way. And in the US, people, educators, lecturers are also starting to use podcasts as learning tools because this is pandemic area as well. There's no way we can meet the students, and we have to, the lecturers have to create learning tools, learning materials accessible in a very creative way, and also very accessible for the students. So yes, we have to educate every stakeholder involved to be able to grow, because listening is a very purba, hal yang sangat purba yang kita lakukan. But then we grow like seeing visual. We like YouTube. We like YouTube so much. We like viral videos, blah blah blah. But then with podcasts, we kind of like relaxed and then give time to ourselves, and we can listen to whatever we want without having anyone else know what we're doing. With YouTube, people sit next to you, can see what you're watching, but with podcasts, it's very personal. So there's also the personality, the personal and intimate vibe that we want to create with podcasts, and that's something that you can make benefit of, educating people about your brands, about your campaigns, blah blah blah.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Chitra. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, audio actually like the oldest way for people to listen or to consume anything. Yeah, from news to story. Yeah, back then we know that people tell story through radio, and we wait for those sandiwara radio thingy. Yeah, which is not familiar with today's generation, I think. Yeah, and Miss Dian also mentioned about how she consumed podcast as a storytelling tools, yeah, to listen stories. This is quite interesting because I myself, I mostly listen podcasts about movie or film or interview because for a film that I like, or maybe I haven't watched yet, yeah, so I just hear about the discussion. And book also, maybe usually some famous books or something that I have not read yet. So I hear the discussion based on the channel. Yeah, sometimes from the media, yeah, Guardian, BBC, they have their own channel for books. I think in Indonesia, Tempo also have those channels like a review. So it quite useful and informative as well. Yeah. Which is not storytelling, yeah. Okay, thank you, Chitra. We have one question from Hanifa in chat. Please, Hanifa, please unmute your microphone.
Yes, good morning, Bu Chitra. I want to ask, so I know that a lot of podcasts talk about sensitive issues, and sometimes famous podcasts get criticism for their opinion, but since podcast is not like a live two-way communication, how do you deal with such situations?
Okay, thank you, Hani.
How do you deal with the criticism about your content?
Yeah, if there is something controversial with what the people in the podcast is.
Yeah, maybe we wait for two more questions, yeah. Thank you, Hanifa. Any other question? Student from newsroom class, we only have Aurelia, Aura. How about Kalista or Edro? Edro, you usually ask lots of questions in class. Anel or Aldi? Novaldi? Where is Novaldi? Is there any question from newsroom and new media classroom?
Yes, Miss. I have
yes.
a question.
Okay, now Valdi, please.
What's the obstacle of making the podcast itself?
The obstacle, okay.
Yeah, the process of making the podcast. Is there any difficulties or obstacle that you ever been?
Okay, obstacle, yeah, maybe also challenges, yeah, later.
Yeah.
Ms. Citra can also. Okay, thank you, Aldi. One more question, maybe from lecturers. Bu Ayu Pita, you have question? Or other students? So we have 3 questions. Yeah, Miss Ayu, please.
Hi, Miss Karin. Hi, Bu Citra.
Hey.
Sorry,
Morning.
I'm so happy to hear your sharing today. And I was told, Miss Karin, actually, I just learned how to make podcasts. So I think it's also relate in what you're saying. So I'm just interested to know, what do you think? Podcast is sort of like the new way of listening to radio in the old days, yeah. When we have nowadays, we have more options to listen to what is it that we want to listen. We have more options. We have more different categories, like you were mentioning. But how do you think? What do you think would be the successful factors in creating podcasts? I mean, if I look on several podcasts that are available, some of them they didn't continue with their podcast. So I also believe continuity is also one of the key points. But what would be the other things that you think would be the key successful factors in creating great podcasts that will actually generate listeners in a long term? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sustainability, ya berarti ya. Okay, so we have 3 questions from Hanifa about the sensitive topic, from Aldi about the challenges and obstacle to create podcast, and the last one from Miss Ayu about how to the sustainability, how to make it like continuing producing podcast. Yeah. Okay, please, Miss Citra.
Okay, thank you, Hanifa, for the question. I think with the podcast, as it's pre-recorded, it's quite similar with YouTube. You have to record it first and then put it on the platform, and then you get criticism afterwards. And how do you deal with that? I think one of the tools to do that is through social media, because you post it somehow, I think, to social media as well, and you can communicate about your thoughts and concerns on social media. Yes, it's quite different also with, like, for example, articles on website or blogs where you can just comment to that and then comment each other on the comment room below the article. It's not available on podcast. It's not available on the platform, the Spotify, but it was something that you can do on SoundCloud. With SoundCloud, you can put comments on a certain minutes of the audio. So it depends on the platform itself currently. So because now we're moving from one platform to another, we put the audio on Spotify, we communicate about our content on social media. From our social media, we get criticism that links back to our content. So I think the best way to approach your audience is through social media and tackle the sensitive issues. On the sensitive issue part, I think it's good to start shaping your podcast from the very beginning with that thought in mind, that things can be sensitive. How do you treat that? What kind of ethics do you apply in producing this content? Because if you listen to like some of the entertaining podcasts currently available on Spotify, some of them kind of say things like, oh, it's fun in Spotify. It's fun with podcasts because no laws can get you. So it's wrong because you can, laws is always fall behind from the action, but there's always law that you can break with doing podcasts the wrong way. So it's good to be cautious from the very beginning. And I would also expect that knowing that you guys are you guys are university students, that you are learning about some journalism ethics or other ethics in general that you can apply to your podcast. Second question from Sally, sorry for the dog. Obstacles in producing the podcast. I think it's different for everyone. The first obstacle that people might face at the very beginning is what you want to say in your podcast. What is it that makes you different? Okay, I like very much horror things. Well, okay, I want to share my horror perspective in the podcast. So what makes you different than podcast Malam Kliwon? What makes you different than Do You See What I See? When we've invited Do You See What I See podcaster on our podcast party last year, he said that it's a user-generated content kind of approach because the podcaster get the horror stories from the audience, sending audio files, and then what he does is mixing the story. So, and then last year he said he has a library of audio horror stories that could last for the next 2 years. So that's kind of approach then an engagement that very genius to get the word spread out. So it's important to ask yourself why do you want to start this podcast? What kind of thing that you want to share, and how do you do that? And it's best to have a good partner in talking about the topics and also discussing about the sound, blah blah blah, because you may not be an expert on everything, but you might be an expert on one thing. So get together with friends who shares the same view, and you can move forwards with your idea, and you can get good feedbacks as well. But it's also doable if you want to do it as a one-man person, one-woman person. So it's also doable. It's up to you. From Ayupita, Ibu Ayupita, thank you so much for your questions. Podcast is a new way of listening to audio. We have more options now. And how do we, the successful factor in creating podcasts? So I think one of the easy way to measure the success is the numbers of play, because it's there, it's objective. You can see that in your statistics. You create podcasts, you put it on platform, you promote it, and you hope to get some plays in return. It's one way to measure success, but the other way is how you use the podcast itself for it went back to your mission in creating the podcast. What do you make this podcast for? Because some podcasts are not trying to reach the biggest number ever, but some are designed to do that. For example, I listened to this podcast on data visualization. It's like data visualization in audio. What is she doing? So
I'm imagining you are trying to, even if it is print, it's difficult. Apalagi kalau didengar.
Yeah, but I enjoyed the way she tells that. She acknowledged that how her friends are very curious. What are you doing data visualization podcast? But then I enjoy how she tells the story. And another thing that an interesting podcast that I listen to is, the productivity tools that we are searching for, like doing the bullet journal, doing blah 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 and things like that to produce our productivity. There are many suggestions available online, blah blah blah, and this podcast is experimenting each and every suggestion by doing that. So they record while doing the bullet journal. Has it changed their mind? Has it boosted their productivity? And then later on, after they try that and record that for a week or so, and then they the hosts are two female. These two friends are discussing whether or not this bullet journal is making differences. So it's a new approach and like understanding the productivity tools, how it's being used and everything. So I think one of the key success is also what kind of idea that you want to push to the audience, or if it's not something new, because there's nothing new under the sun, what kind of new approach that you are trying to do with this idea. Like I mentioned again, the example from podcast Malam Kliwon, horror has many players in Indonesia, and they want to do that still because they believe that they have this different approach with comedy that others have not done. So that's also something that we sell. It can be the idea, or it can be the approach. It can also be the format, how we say and deliver our message. So it can be different things. There's also a new podcast from Spotify. It's a Spotify original in Australia. It's about sex, and they talk about what people are searching on internet, and then they talk about that particular phenomenon. So it has very various formats and topics available out there. You just have to grab it and find your niche there.
Yeah. Because it's a very niche market, yeah.
Yeah,
you have to have a very clear positioning when you try to produce content, like horror, for example, or apa tadi yang curhat-curhat gitu ya. Rintik sendu.
Seduh.
Seduh. So ternyata fansnya banyak ya. Okay, any other questions from the audience? Students from PR or entertainment com, yeah. Megan, you have question?
Yes, Karen.
Ya. Siapa ini yang bicara?
Azril, Miss.
Yeah. Okay, Azril. Yes, Azril, please.
Miss Citra, who is your biggest inspiration for you to start your podcast career?
Oh yeah, that's a good question, Azril. Why you want to be in ini ya, podcast or radio? That's good one. Thank you, Azril. Any other question? Kalista or Leticia, Ale, Nikki. I think we can have one or two more questions, yeah, before we finish the session. Or from the older batch, yeah, we have Talia, Salsa, and Nazira. You have question, please? Ya. Siapa itu tadi? Nazira, you have question? Or Salsa? Gaby, where is Gaby?
I think this is the biggest challenge in doing online learning. Yeah?
I'm here, miss.
Yeah, you want to ask something, Gaby? You usually have lots to ask. Please.
I think one of the questions that I would like to ask is that since Ibu Citra talked about the controversial topics like LGBTQ or probably people coming out, is that kind of content, is controversial content in Indonesia going to catch audiences more, or is it rather not something that audiences want to listen? That's from me.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you, Gaby. Okay, one last question. Any finish you want to ask, or Adele? We have Adele in here. Adele, you have question, or Sanju?
Hello,
Okay.
Miss.
Yes, Sanju, you have question?
No, Miss.
Oh,
The
no.
question I wanted to ask sudah ditanya Bayu tadi, Miss.
Oh, dia tanya Bayu ya. Okay. From lecturer ya. Sorry, no question. Okay. Yeah. So we have two last question from siapa tadi? Gaby and Azril ya. Please, Miss Citra.
Okay, maybe I would like to answer Gabriela's question first. I wouldn't say that LGBTIQ is a controversial issue. I would say that it's a sensitive and delicate issue, and it takes more thorough research and ethics to do a good one, because you don't want to put stigma on the people or give a wrong impression about that person. So I wouldn't say it's a controversial issue, but I would say that it's a delicate and sensitive issue that you should be prepared of in working on. Would controversial issues get more audience? Well, that's what people aim with viral videos, but I think it goes back to yourself again. What kind of content do you want? It's not easy to create viral videos. It's not easy to be viral, be controversial, and then be okay with that. I mean, like, not everyone is like Deddy Corbuzier, for example. Deddy Corbuzier is, can have some controversial topics and also guests, but is he doing it the right way? We can discuss that thoroughly from a journalism perspective, for example. Is he doing a good job in interviewing people? Or is he just riding the wave and enjoying the publicity of the guest, of the topic and everything? So it's a good discussion topic to really scrutinize the podcast of Deddy Corbuzier, because it's very popular. People refer it all the time. People listen and also watch it on YouTube. So it's good to have it as a discussion with journalism students. Is he doing a good thing? Is controversial topics is good with done like that? So I think it's a good discussion for your class as well. With Azril, the inspiration to do podcast, I think one of the first podcasts that I listen and I'm very engaged with is the Startup Podcast. A startup podcast is not that I'm an entrepreneur or something, but it's the way he tells the story is very captivating. Startup tells a story about Alex Bloomberg, who started the Gimlet Media before he even think that he would use Gimlet as the name of the company. So he started as, he tells the story with all the audio gimmicks and everything, the audio atmosphere and everything, to like telling a story to you about how he started the business. He was a journalist from NPR. He was a producing team for Freakonomics podcast, one of the most popular podcasts in the US. And then he decided he wants to create his own podcast company. And then he speaking, talking while thinking, the kind of stuff, because he shares about the list of names that he has for his company. He even recorded when we met his investor for the first time, and then share it everything with us. He also in one of the episodes, he also have this episode on how they deal with crisis, because the example that they have is they have this certain ads put in the podcast, and then it creates some troubles, and he explains thoroughly with interviews, with everything, when telling the story on how they deal with that. So it's a very nice and entertaining and engaging podcast, because you can learn step by step on how he built the company, what kind of struggle, what kind of excitement, what kind of deal that going on in the background. So it's nice to get some grasp of the like behind the scene kind of thing. Gimlet is the company that Spotify bought in 2019 something. At that time, Spotify bought Gimlet as the content production company and also Anchor as the podcast production outlet. So it shows also how Spotify is very serious in opening and creating market for podcasts. So I think you should listen to Startup and feel the grasp of new approach in audio storytelling. And also, it's also good to have a different look on how investigative story is being done. Because in the US in 2014 and 15, when Serial was a big hit, it was created as a learning tool as well for the journalism students. They scrutinize how she tells the story, how she invites her audience during her way to investigate. Because in investigative stories, usually we were just given the final output. This is what we found. With Serial, she invites us as listeners to like, okay, what to do next? What kind of documents do I need? Blah blah blah. She asks us all the way on the journey. So it's a different approach. There have been pros and cons of the approach, but I think it's good for discussion.
Okay, thank you, Chitra and everyone. I think for the last one, I am interested to also we discuss about content, how to choose topic, target audience, and everything. Yeah, in your slide you mentioned about the tools and like the technology, how to do it. Yeah, so maybe you could go back to the how to. Jadi peralatan apa sih yang kita butuhkan to create one, ya? And then because later our students will learn to actually create that one. My question will be how to start from the tools, preparing the tools. Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. I'm sharing these slides again on the tools, what you need to have. Of course, you need something to record on. You can use a microphone or you can just use your phone. Current smartphones are good enough with the audio quality, but if you want to invest more on the microphone, you can search for condenser microphone. There are lots of on marketplace like a podcast set, something like that. You can start with that. Or if you start with a smartphone, I think it's also good enough. You need to have a good headphone because you need to have you need to check the quality of the audio that you're doing. Otherwise, because audio is the only way that people can access your content. There's no supporting visual. There's no supporting paper that they can read on. It's only audio, so it has to be crystal clear. We don't. I mean, for example, if I listen to a podcast and it's badly recorded, I would not want to listen, no matter how good the content is, because it's just dragging to listen to a bad audio. And then we have the tools to edit. That's why Anchor is very popular right now, because it provides you with everything. You record with your smartphone and put it on Anchor, and then Anchor will distribute on Spotify and everything. So it's also a good way to start. If you want to do, for example, you want to do a Q&A with your friend, because it's a remote situation, you can use Zoom online meeting like this and record that. You can have both video recording and audio recording done at the same time, and you can try which are more successful, the video format or the audio only format. So it's also a nice way to experiment. And another tools that you can use if you want to record with a friend being part in remote areas, in remote part other than yours. You can also use Zencaster as a podcast recording platform, and which can record your voice and your partner voice as a different track. So you have different tools, but the easiest way, simple way would be with Anchor or just record a Zoom meeting. Just be careful with the internet connection because it depends solely on that. I think that should be enough to start. Again, it's what's more important is what do you want to say in your podcast. The tools is just supporting equipment.
Yeah. So basically, we can start now. Yeah. I mean, we don't have to have a proper tools for recording.
Unless,
I mean, if
unless you may want
to
make excuses to buy something, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much, Ibu Chitra, yeah, for the very fruitful session. It's eye-opening for us because usually we discuss about more on print, broadcast like TV or radio, but now we have a new insight from podcast.